The sun burned low across the open plains, painting the land in shades of gold and fire. The wind carried dust through the quiet town, rattling wooden signs and whistling between the cracks of old saloon doors. On the far edge of this forgotten place lived a man whose name most folks barely remembered. They called him the rancher, a figure who kept to himself, with nothing but cattle, silence, and the vast stretch of land to fill his days. He was tall, weathered by years of hard work, and his face told stories he never spoke out loud. Some said he had once known love, that he had once laughed freely, but those days had slipped away like water through rough hands. Now he rode the fields alone, ate alone, and spoke to no one unless he had to. Life on the frontier was not kind to men like him. Every morning was the same. Saddle the horse, check the fences, tend the herd, fight against the endless dust. At night, when the town lights flickered in the distance, he sat on his porch with only the sound of crickets and coyotes to remind him he wasn't the last soul left alive. The people in town often wondered why he chose to live so far out, away from voices and laughter. Some believed it was pride, others thought it was sorrow. Whatever the reason, he carried it like a shadow that never left. One evening, he tied his horse outside the saloon. He rarely came into town, but when he did, people noticed. Boots scraped across the dirt, and heads turned when he walked inside. He wasn't the kind of man who wasted words, but his presence filled the room. The bartender nodded, sliding a glass across the counter. The rancher drank slow, his eyes steady, until he noticed a commotion at the far end of the room. A man, half fallen from his chair, slurred words no one wanted to hear. His hands shook as he waved a bottle in the air, shouting about debts and misfortune. He was a father, though you wouldn't know it by looking at him. His clothes were torn, his breath thick with liquor, and his eyes carried nothing but desperation. Behind him, standing in silence, was a girl, small, pale, with eyes that seemed to hold more fear than childhood. The crowd shifted uneasily. The father spoke of selling what he had left, pointing at her as though she were an object. A hush fell over the room. The rancher set down his glass. Something in that moment drew him closer. The man's words tumbled out like broken glass, sharp and jagged, cutting through the smoky air of the saloon. His voice carried the weight of shame, but also the boldness that only too much whiskey could give. People shifted in their seats, eyes darting from the drunken father to the small girl standing just behind him. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She didn't even blink when he raised his voice and slammed the bottle down on the table, making the lanterns on the walls tremble. "She can't hear a thing," he shouted, his tone uneven. "Worthless to me, worthless to anyone. But I'll take a few coins. Enough for another drink, enough to forget." The silence that followed was heavy, like a storm about to break. The townsfolk had seen many things in their lives: fights over land, shootings in the street, fortunes won and lost in a single card game. But this was different. Selling a child. Even here, in a place where mercy was rare, it was a line most would not cross. Whispers rippled through the room. A woman covered her mouth in shock. A man by the piano muttered a curse under his breath. Yet no one stood up, no one spoke against it. Fear, perhaps, or the thought that the girl truly had no worth if she could not hear or speak. The rancher leaned against the bar, his glass untouched now. His eyes narrowed on the girl. She was young, maybe 10 or 11, though her thin frame made her look smaller. Her hair fell in loose strands across her face, and her hands clutched the folds of her worn dress. She stared at the ground, never meeting a single gaze. To anyone else, she was invisible, just another piece of a broken man's misery. But the rancher saw something else. He saw how her fingers twitched when the father's voice rose, how her shoulders tightened when the bottle hit the table. She wasn't empty, she wasn't without feeling. The father barked again, his words slurring. "No use keeping her, can't feed her, can't talk to her, she's nothing but a burden." His laugh was hollow, a sound that made even the drunkest men turn away. He stretched out his hand, palm open, waiting for silver. Still, no one moved. The saloon had grown so quiet that the creak of a chair sounded like thunder. Eyes slid to the rancher, as though the room itself expected him to act. He was not a man known for kindness, at least not openly. He was quiet, distant, and some whispered that loneliness had hardened him like stone. But tonight, something stirred in him. He stepped forward, slow and steady, boots striking the wooden floor with weight that silenced even the faintest whispers. The father squinted up at him, unsteady on his feet, trying to straighten as if to look braver than he felt. "What are you offering?" the rancher asked, his voice low but clear. The father's grin showed broken teeth. "Whatever you got in your pocket, enough for a bottle, maybe two." He waved the bottle in his hand as if to seal the deal. The rancher's jaw tightened. He pulled a few coins from his pocket, silver catching the glow of the lanterns. He placed them on the table without another word. The father's eyes lit up with greed, snatching the money before it even settled. His hands shook as he counted, already calling for another drink, already forgetting the girl he had just given away. The rancher turned his gaze on her. She didn't lift her head, didn't make a sound. But in that silence, he felt the weight of a choice heavier than any cattle he'd branded or land he'd fenced. He motioned for her to follow. She hesitated, her small feet rooted to the ground, until her father barked at her to move. She flinched at the sound, then stepped forward, almost as though her body obeyed on instinct. The saloon doors swung open as the rancher led her out into the night. The crowd inside exhaled, some shaking their heads, others whispering that he'd lost his mind. A rancher, alone, taking in a deaf girl with nothing to give. What kind of sense was that? But no one dared say it too loudly. They watched the doors swing shut. The image of the girl burned into their thoughts. Outside, the air was cooler, carrying the smell of dust and distant rain. The rancher untied his horse, steadying the reins as the girl stood still, unsure of what to do. He didn't push her, didn't rush her. Instead, he waited, giving her space to decide whether to step forward. After a long pause, she did. Her hand brushed against the saddle, hesitant, as though the animal might turn on her. The rancher lifted her gently, setting her in place before climbing up behind her. The ride back was quiet, the only sound the steady rhythm of hooves against dry earth. The girl sat stiffly, her hands gripping the saddle horn, her head turned slightly as though she listened, not to him but to something beyond. He noticed it. The way her body tensed when coyotes howled in the distance, the way her shoulders shifted at the rustle of a rabbit darting through brush. He said nothing, but a thought pressed against the back of his mind. The moon followed them across the sky, pale light spilling over the wide fields. The rancher kept his eyes on the horizon, though his thoughts were fixed on the girl behind him. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. All he knew was that tonight his life had shifted. A door had opened that he had not expected, and whether he was ready or not, he had stepped through it. By the time the ranch came into view, the girl's head had dipped, her exhaustion pulling her into restless sleep. The rancher slowed his horse, careful not to wake her. He looked at the outline of his home against the dark sky, the same home that had always felt too big, too empty. For the first time in years, it no longer looked hollow. It looked like the beginning of something else, though he could not yet name what it was. The house on the ranch was simple, built of timber darkened by years of sun and wind. Its roof creaked when the night breeze passed, and the porch groaned under the weight of old wood. Inside, the air carried the scent of earth, leather, and smoke from the fire that had long kept the place alive. When the rancher pushed the door open and stepped in, the girl followed slowly, her bare feet making no sound against the floor. She looked around with wide eyes, not curious but cautious, as though she had stepped into a stranger's dream and feared she would be chased out at any moment. The rancher lit a lantern, its soft glow spilling across the single room. A table, a few chairs, a worn rug, shelves filled with tools and supplies. Nothing about the place spoke of warmth or family. It was a working man's home, built for function, not comfort. The girl stood near the door, clutching the edges of her dress as if holding herself together. She did not sit, did not wander, did not make a sound. The rancher studied her for a moment, then set a plate on the table. bread, a slice of meat, and a cup of water. He motioned for her to sit. She didn't move at first. Her eyes flicked to him, then to the food, then back to the ground. He pulled out a chair, pushing it gently toward her. At last she stepped forward, sliding into the seat as though every motion had to be calculated. She ate carefully, not out of greed, but as though each bite needed permission. The rancher watched without speaking, arms crossed loosely. He could see the hunger in her, though she tried to hide it by chewing slow, her gaze fixed on the plate instead of him. He poured her more water when the cup ran low, and for the first time her eyes lifted. Just a glance, quick as lightning, before she lowered them again. The fire crackled in the hearth, breaking the silence with its steady rhythm. Outside, coyotes called to one another across the plains. The rancher leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady on the girl. She did not meet his eyes, but he noticed how her hands shook when the logs popped loudly in the flames. Her shoulders jumped, though she tried to mask it by taking another bite of bread. When she finished, he showed her the small room at the back of the house. A cot, a blanket, and a wooden chest stood there. It was plain, but it was hers. She stepped inside slowly, tracing her fingers over the blanket as though she had never seen one so clean. She sat, testing the mattress, then looked up at him with a flicker of something unreadable in her gaze. He nodded once, then stepped out, leaving her to rest. The nights on the ranch were long, filled with the groans of the house and the chorus of crickets. The rancher lay awake, listening to the silence between sounds. He thought of the girl in the back room, thought of the father who had given her up for the price of a bottle. He turned on his side, staring at the wall, but the image of her thin frame and haunted eyes refused to fade. Morning came with the cry of roosters and the pale light of dawn spilling across the plains. The rancher rose as he always did, pulling on his boots, washing at the basin, and stepping out to the corral. The cattle stirred, lowing as he spread feed, while the horse stamped the ground impatiently. He moved with practiced ease, his hands steady on the ropes and tools. Yet out of the corner of his eye he noticed her. The girl stood by the porch, watching. Barefoot, her hair tangled, her dress still rumpled from sleep. She did not move closer, only stood there, arms wrapped around herself. He worked without speaking, but every now and then his gaze slid back to her. She followed his every motion with quiet intensity, as though memorizing the rhythm of his world. When the sun rose higher, he set down his tools and beckoned her forward. She hesitated, then stepped slowly into the dirt, her small footprints trailing behind her. He led her to the barn, showing her the stalls, the tools, the hay bales stacked high. He pointed at each one, naming them in his rough, steady voice. She did not respond, but her eyes moved where he pointed, her fingers sometimes brushing against what he showed her. When he handed her a small bucket, she held it tightly, waiting for his nod before carrying it to the trough. She worked carefully, not quickly, but with precision, as if afraid to spill a drop. The days began to form a pattern. She rose early, following him at a distance. He showed her simple tasks, feeding chickens, gathering eggs, carrying water. She never spoke, never made a sound, but her silence was not empty. It was filled with unspoken questions, with glances that flickered like sparks before she pulled them back into herself. At night, she sat by the fire, folding her hands in her lap. Sometimes she traced shapes on the table with her finger, lines and circles that meant nothing to him but seemed to comfort her. He tried to speak a few words, slow and clear, but she only tilted her head, watching his lips without reply. Yet there were moments, small ones, that caught his attention. A dropped spoon clattering on the floor made her flinch before she quickly stilled herself. The low rumble of thunder far away made her glance toward the window, her body tightening as though bracing for something. The rancher noticed these things, though he kept them to himself. Days turned into weeks. The girl grew stronger, her cheeks no longer hollow, her steps no longer weak. The rancher saw the change, but he also saw the distance she kept, as though part of her still lived in another world. He did not push. He did not demand. He only gave her space, a place to belong, and waited. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in fire, He watched her stand by the fence, her hand resting on the wood. The cattle moved in the distance, their calls rising in the still air. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing, and for the briefest moment he thought he saw recognition there, an awareness of sound, of life beyond silence. He stayed where he was, saying nothing, but a thought pressed against him like the weight of the setting sun. Perhaps she heard more than anyone believed. The rancher had never cared much for the talk of townsfolk, but now their voices followed him like shadows. When he rode into town for supplies, whispers rose as quick as dust behind a galloping horse. Men leaning against the post office muttered under their breath. Women outside the general store exchanged looks when he passed. Some said he'd taken leave of his senses, wasting coin on a burden. Others suggested darker things, things spoken in hushed tones that made his jaw tighten. He ignored them as best he could, but he saw the way they looked at the girl when he brought her along. She walked beside him, head down, hands clasped, silent as ever. To them she was strange, broken, a child with no future. To him she was something different. He didn't yet know what, but he knew it wasn't what they claimed. Back on the ranch, the days carried a rhythm. Cattle lowed in the fields, the horses' hooves struck the earth with steady beats, and the wind whispered through the grass. The girl moved among it all like a ghost, present but untouched, watching more than she acted. She learned quickly, carrying buckets without spilling, stacking kindling neatly, gathering eggs with careful hands. She never made a sound, yet her silence seemed to speak in ways no one else could hear. Still, the rancher's mind began to stir with questions he couldn't quiet. It was the small things at first. One morning, when a hammer slipped from his grasp and clattered loudly onto the barn floor, she jerked her head toward the sound before quickly forcing her eyes back to her task. Another time, when thunder rolled across the horizon, she paused mid-step, glancing at the sky long before the storm drew near. He told himself it was chance, instinct, the way anyone might react to sudden movements. Yet the thought lodged in his mind and refused to let go. He began to notice more. The way her breathing shifted when coyotes howled in the night. The way her shoulders tightened at the bark of a dog down the road. The way her eyes flickered when his boots struck too hard against the porch. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills and the fields glowed orange, he tested her. He stood behind her while she watched the chickens scatter across the yard. He called her name, not that he knew it, but the name he'd given her in his mind. He said it softly at first. She didn't move. Then louder, firmer, still nothing. But when he dropped a wooden bucket on the ground with a sharp crack, she flinched before she caught herself, her hand curling tight against her dress. He felt a chill run through him, not of fear but of realization. She wasn't deaf, not completely, maybe not at all. But why would she pretend? Why would her father claim she could not hear, could not speak? The next days passed in heavy silence, heavier than before. The rancher worked as usual, but his eyes lingered on her more often. She avoided his gaze as if she sensed the questions burning in him. When he tried to meet her eyes, she turned away. When he spoke slowly, clearly, she stared at the ground, refusing to give him what he was searching for. The town grew restless too. At the saloon, men chuckled bitterly, saying the rancher had been fooled, paying for a girl who could neither work nor talk. Others whispered of pity gone too far. A few wondered aloud what would happen when he tired of her, when the burden grew too heavy. The rancher heard these things, and though he showed no reaction, the words lodged deep, grinding against his thoughts like grit in an old wound. One afternoon, he took her with him into town. They walked down the main street, the sound of horses snorting and wagons rolling filling the air. A man nearby dropped a sack of grain with a loud thud. She startled, eyes darting toward the sound before she quickly masked it. The rancher saw it. So did others. He caught the narrow eyes of a shopkeeper watching closely, lips curling into a smirk. That night, as the lantern flickered low inside the house, the rancher sat at the table, staring at her across the room. She sat by the fire, her small hands folded in her lap. The shadows stretched long across the walls, wrapping the house in quiet. He spoke her name again, firm and low. She didn't move. He sighed, leaning back, his gaze heavy with unspoken words. The questions weighed on him more each day. He thought of her father, of the drunken slur in the saloon, of the coins exchanged for a child's life. What if the man had lied? What if he had called her deaf because it made her easier to sell? Or what if the girl herself had chosen the silence, retreating into it as a shield against a world too cruel to face? The rancher didn't know, and that not knowing gnawed at him. He watched her carefully, testing without meaning to. A door slammed in the wind and she jumped. A horse neighed outside, and her head turned slightly toward it. Each time she tried to still herself quickly, as though hiding the truth from him. Yet even as his doubts grew, so did his patience. He did not demand answers, did not corner her with questions she might not understand or might not want to face. Instead, he waited, knowing that truth has a way of rising, like the sun creeping over the horizon no matter how dark the night. And still, the town whispered. And still, the girl stayed silent. And still, the rancher's mind circled the same question that refused to leave him. Could she hear all along? The storm came without warning. One moment the sky was clear, painted in soft blues and streaks of light, and the next it was swallowed by heavy gray clouds rolling fast across the horizon. The wind picked up, sharp and restless, rattling the shutters and pushing dust across the yard. The rancher had seen storms before, but something in the way this one gathered made him quicken his steps. He hurried to pull tools into the barn, to latch the stable doors, to tie down anything that might break loose. The girl stood on the porch, her small frame silhouetted against the darkening sky. Her hands clutched the wooden rail, her eyes fixed on the shifting heavens. She didn't move when thunder cracked in the distance, not at first. But when the sound grew closer, deeper, rolling through the ground beneath their feet, she flinched. It was slight, quick, but he caught it. Her fingers tightened, her shoulders rose, her breath hitched. "Inside," the rancher said, his voice firm, motioning toward the door. She looked at him, then back at the sky, as if caught between fear and fascination. Another rumble shook the earth, and this time she darted inside without hesitation. The rain came heavy, sheets of water slamming against the roof, pouring from the eaves like rivers. The house groaned under the force of the wind, and the windows rattled in their frames. The lantern flickered, shadows dancing wildly on the walls. The girl sat near the fire, her knees pulled close, her eyes wide. Every time thunder struck, her head twitched toward the sound, her body betraying her even as she tried to stay still. The rancher pretended not to watch. He tended the fire, checked the door, made sure the shutters held. But each time lightning lit the room and thunder followed, he saw her react. Her flinch was sharper than before, her breath quicker. It was no longer a question in his mind, it was truth. She could hear. Then came the crash. A tree, weakened by the storm, split in two and fell hard across the fence outside. The sound boomed like a gunshot, shaking the ground. The girl screamed. It wasn't loud, not strong, but it was real. A sound pulled from the depths of silence, unpracticed and rough, yet unmistakable. The rancher froze where he stood, his eyes fixed on her. Her hands flew to her mouth as if she could force the sound back inside. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks as she shook her head in panic. She looked at him with fear, as though she had given away her most guarded secret. Her body curled in on itself, trembling in the firelight. The rancher moved slowly, not wanting to frighten her more. He crouched down to her level, his face steady, his eyes softer than she had ever seen. "You can hear," he said quietly, almost a whisper, as if speaking the truth too loudly might break her apart. She shook her head, then nodded, then shook it again. Words tumbled in her throat but never found shape. At last she let her hands drop, her voice breaking through in fragments. "Not always," she said, the sound fragile, halting but clear enough. "I hear some things, loud things." Her lips trembled as she spoke, as though every word cost her something. The rancher waited. He didn't push. He let her gather the pieces of herself. Finally, through hiccuping breaths, she explained. Her father had told people she was deaf because it was easier. Easier to dismiss her, easier to make excuses, easier to sell her when the time came. She had stayed silent because silence was safe. Speaking had only ever brought anger, punishment, or mockery, so she had hidden her voice away, burying it in the quiet where no one could hurt her. Her confession spilled out in broken sentences, but the meaning was clear. She wasn't deaf, not fully. She had chosen the quiet because the world had given her no kindness when she tried to speak. Her father's cruelty, the town's whispers, the shame of being different, these had all wrapped around her until silence was the only shield she had left. The rancher listened without interruption, his rough hands resting on his knees, his steady gaze never leaving her face. He saw the years of fear etched into her, the weight of a childhood stolen. He didn't try to fix it with quick words. He simply listened, the fire crackling between them, the storm raging outside. When her voice broke entirely and tears took over, he handed her a cloth, slow and gentle. She clutched it tight, wiping her face as though trying to erase the moment. He didn't move closer, didn't try to touch her, but the steadiness in his presence filled the room with something stronger than comfort. It was safety, quiet and sure. The thunder rolled on, but she no longer flinched. She sat with him by the fire, her shoulders loosening as the truth hung between them, no longer hidden. For the first time since she had stepped into his world, she had spoken. And for the first time he had truly heard her, not just with his ears but with something deeper, something that reached into the silence and gave it meaning. The storm outside began to ease, the rain softening to a steady patter, the wind losing its bite. The rancher stirred the fire, adding another log, while the girl's eyes grew heavy from exhaustion. She leaned against the chair, her breath evening out, her small body curling into rest. The rancher sat back, his gaze fixed on the flames. He thought of her father's words in the saloon, the lies that had been passed as truth, the way the town had believed without question. And then he thought of the scream that had broken free, raw and real, shattering the silence she had carried for so long. The house was quiet again, but it was no longer the same silence. It wasn't empty. It wasn't hollow. It carried the echo of her voice, fragile but alive, a sound he knew he would not forget. The days after the storm carried a different weight. The air felt clearer, washed clean by the heavy rains, but inside the ranch, something else had shifted. The girl no longer seemed like the silent shadow who drifted from chore to chore. She still moved quietly, still kept her words tucked away most of the time, but her eyes no longer hid in the ground. Every so often, when she thought he wasn't watching, she would glance up at the rancher, curiosity flickering there like the faint glow of embers. The rancher noticed the small changes. At breakfast, when he set food before her, she whispered, "Thank you," so softly it might have been mistaken for the rustle of the wind. When he handed her a bucket to fill, she tried to repeat the word water, her lips shaky, the sound awkward but there. Each attempt was clumsy, but it was more than silence, and he treated it with the same care he gave to his cattle in spring, when new life was fragile and in need of patience. He never demanded more than she gave. He never raised his voice or forced her to speak. Instead, he gave her space, nodding when she tried, listening without judgment when she faltered. The girl seemed to feel the difference, as though for the first time in her life her words, whether broken or whole, were safe. The town, however, was not so easily softened. Whispers turned sharper, and eyes followed them whenever they appeared together. Some men leaned against fences, smirking, wondering aloud how long the rancher's charity would last. Women clutched their children closer as if the girl were something strange, someone not to be trusted. The rancher ignored it all, his steady stride carrying him through town with the same unyielding patience he had for mending fences or breaking a wild horse. The girl stayed close to him, her steps small but determined, her silence no longer born of shame but of caution. On the ranch, life pressed forward. The fields needed tending, the cattle needed driving, and the endless work of the land filled their days. Yet in the quiet hours, something new began to grow between them. The rancher taught her simple words, pointing at tools and animals, speaking slowly, letting her try to repeat. "Horse," he said, touching the animal's mane. She echoed it faintly, her voice unsteady but eager. "Bread," he said at the table, breaking it in half. She whispered it, smiling slightly when he nodded in approval. Each word was a step, each sound a victory. And with every attempt, she began to trust her voice more, as though the silence that once caged her was slowly cracking open. The rancher watched it happen, quiet pride warming a heart he thought had long gone cold. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson, the girl stood by the fence, staring at the horizon. The rancher approached, leaning on the post beside her. She turned, hesitating, then spoke with effort. "Pretty." The word was broken, stretched thin, but it was clear. He glanced at her, then back at the sunset, and nodded once. "Yes, pretty." For the first time, her lips curved into a small, uncertain smile. The bond between them deepened, not with grand gestures but with the steady rhythm of shared life. She fed chickens while he fixed the barn roof. She carried water while he tended the herd. They spoke little, but the silences were no longer heavy. They were filled with understanding, with trust, with the slow weaving of two lives that had once been separate and now began to entwine. At night, she no longer hid in her room as soon as the fire burned low. Instead, she lingered by the hearth, watching the flames dance. Sometimes she traced letters in the dirt with a stick, shapes that didn't always make sense but carried the effort of someone who wanted to learn. The rancher noticed, and one evening he pulled a worn book from the shelf, laying it open before her. She looked at the pages, her fingers brushing the words, and though she could not read them yet, her eyes shone with something new, hope. The world beyond the ranch was not so kind, but inside those wooden walls, a new story began to write itself. The rancher found himself listening for her voice, waiting for the small sound she dared to release. And when she offered them, he treated them like treasures, never mocking, never pressing, only listening with the patience of a man who knew the value of things that took time to grow. Still, the memories of her father lingered in her. Some nights she woke with a start, her breath quick, her body trembling from dreams she never spoke aloud. On those nights, the rancher didn't question her. He simply stoked the fire, letting the warmth fill the room, and sat near enough that she could see he was there, steady and unmovable. In time, the fear in her eyes softened, replaced by something stronger than words: trust. The cattle grew fat on the summer grass, the fields turned green after the storm's rains, and the days stretched long under the sun. The rancher worked as he always had, but now, when he looked at the porch in the evening, he no longer saw emptiness. He saw her sitting there, small but present, her eyes lifted to the sky, her voice whispering words she had once buried. It was not the life he had expected, nor the one he had imagined when he rode alone across the plains. But as the days passed, he began to understand that sometimes the things we never look for find us all the same, and when they do, they change the silence into something far more powerful than sound.